Hey there! Today we're going to talk about this ink, Diamine Oxblood. That may sound a little odd, but if I understand correctly, Oxblood was actually used for writing back in the day. O Titus, comest thou hither, and bringest me the Oxblood ink? And now Diamine has given us Oxblood. I'm sure it doesn't really contain Oxblood, but it's a very good approximation of the color, I guess, because when this stuff dries up, it really looks like dried blood. And I don't think it's for everyone, but if you're looking for an interesting red, sort of reddish brown, brownish red, whatever you'd like to call that, you should seriously consider getting this ink, because it flows pretty well. I've never had any problems with Diamine inks. Occasionally I get a bit of a startup issue, but I get startup issues with every red ink I use. I think it's somehow related to the color or something. I don't know, the properties of the ink. But in general, I think it's a very cool looking ink that performs well, works well, doesn't feather a lot, and it's just awesome. A lot of people buy this for the name, I think, and I see why. So I think the best thing I can do is just show you how it writes, and that's what we'll do next. So I hope this is going to be useful, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye. Okay, so here we go with adjusting the paper. No, with Diamine Oxblood, which is not as blood red as you may have expected, but this is more like dried blood, I think, and you'll see that when it dries it gets a very typical color, which I like a lot. Okay, let's start with a bit of fine writing. And then medium. You'll notice that this is already quite a bit darker than the fine, of course. This really dark brown, I'm not sure how much justice my camera does to this, but it's a deep, dark, reddish brown. It's really like dried blood. That was broad, and then an italic nib. Okay, then let's do a test with some passes to give you a bit of an idea of the saturation of the ink. 1, 2, 3. This 6mm pilot parallel nib really, I think, makes clear what a dark, deep brown this is. It's really reddish. I've got the feeling my camera makes it a bit darker still, but this is definitely a reddish brown. So it's not black, it's not a very dark brown to the sense that it has no red in it. It actually has quite a bit of red in it. So we'll see. I hope that the still shots will make this clear. For now, as that dries, let's do a bit more writing. Let's start with some flexy writing. Quite some nice shading, I think. Going from a very, well, a dark brown to a much really dark, intense brown. Trying to squeeze a little bit of line variation out of this pen. Not the most flexible nib ever, but just to give you an idea. Then we have a broad nib, which lays down a lot of ink. You see that in this case, with the very wet broad nib, this is really almost black. I think it's a beautifully shaded ink, and the color it has really depends on the nib, how wet it is, how broad it is, how flexible it is. And finally, some metallic writing. You see here it's much redder. This is not a dry nib at all. But here it's a darker red, whereas this was almost black. So a lot of variation, that's all I'm saying. It's a bit of a surprise what you'll end up with. Okay. I wonder how dry this is yet. Dry, that bit is a bit wet still, I guess. Well, let's do one bit of writing with the very wide nib. O for Oxblood. There we go. And I think this is dry enough now. I'll do a second pass here. And I'll come back for a third pass in a short while. Okay, medium nib. For some writing, we'll try to smear with water. It's a reasonably wet ink, but it also tends to dry fairly quickly. For example, this, as you can see, is already dry. This was very wet writing, the broad writing sample, so that's still wet, but all of this is dry. So he said it's dry, and then wiped out just a little bit, but it smeared it. But that's fine. It's you know, pretty much dry here, I'd say. Okay, so that's good. Well, let us start working on the scorecard, and then well, this is probably, yeah, that's pretty much dry. Let's smear that a bit with some water. Well, that's interesting. Very interesting. Okay, this is still too wet. I cannot try to put water on that yet. That wouldn't be fair. This. It's dryish. A third and final pass. There we go. So, scorecard, and I'll return to that, and I'll return to this. How easy is it to clean this ink? Well, it's okay. It's a red, and it's a highly saturated red, so it may leave, you know, a little bit of discoloration on clear plastic, but so far I have to say I haven't really experienced any large problems. It's a diamine ink. I find those inks to be very well behaved, so bleed through, we can only judge that later on. Where's the T? There it is. Color. Well, dark red, brown, I'm not sure. Dried blood, whatever does that for you. Shading. Well, there is shade, but it seems to shade more between nibs than within a nib. I mean, as you can see here, you see some shading, but I don't think it's extremely pronounced. Whereas the shading between those two, I mean, it's just a completely different shade of ink. So I'd say shading is good. Between pens. Flow for a red is pretty good. However, being a red, I sometimes have startup issues, especially if I haven't used a pen for, you know, a few hours or longer. You start up, you get some issues. Drying time, well, okay, I guess. It can be a bit long. Waterproofness, well, you see it here now, even though it's not completely dry yet. That really looks like blood. A little uncomfortable here. Waterproofness, I would say, is, well, poor at best. You still see some writing, but it's pretty much gone. Okay, so let's have a look at the three passes, where you can see it goes from a lighter shade to a much darker shade there. This is really dark. It's also very matte. It's not a shiny ink. I kind of enjoy this in ink. So it goes from a lighter to a much darker brown color. Okay. I want to do a bit of writing on some cheap paper. Start with fine. Well, reddish brown, I'd say. Medium. Just to save some paper, I'll just write the quick brown fox. I'm writing fairly largely here. So far, I don't see any feathering. And that's quite a bit of ink. This is a lot of ink too, and I'm still not seeing any feathering. This usually brings out some feathering, flex writing. Railroad, my fault, I misaligned the nib. Yeah, here we get some feathering. Okay, so it's possible to make it feather, but even with a 6mm wide nib, there's no real issue. That looks pretty good to me. Bleed through? Yes, for the flex writing and the really wide nib, and maybe a few points here and there, but I would say that's not that bad. I've seen worse. And on the Rhodia paper there is pretty much no bleed through at all. Even with the 3 passes, it's not really bad, just some shade through. So I would say bleed through is good. What did I miss? Cleaning, I've got it. Bleed through, color, shading, flow is good. Feathering. I always have 8 points, so there had to be something. Feathering, I would say, is good. I mean, you really have to use cheap paper and really fully flex a nib, because even with a broad nib, as you can see here, there's just no real feathering. So that's pretty good. Waterproofness, you see this has turned into a fairly disgusting mess, and the writing is gone there. So that's waterproofness. Okay, so now that these are dry, you see the shading there, going from a red to a very dark brown. It's really like dried blood. I think that's the only way to describe it. It has a bit of a gold sheen. I'm not sure how well you can see that. It's not as pronounced as with 1670 Rouge et Matite, but it's still, sometimes it's a bit pronounced, especially in broader nibs. So that's, I think you see that with a lot of reds. Something you'll have to live with, but you know, it's not nearly as pronounced as with some other inks. So there you have it, an Inkcyclopedia entry for Diamine Oxblood. I think it's a very nice ink, quite versatile, very nice deep color without being too distracting. I can really recommend it. Great flow, never had any issues with that. So just maybe a little bit of a startup issue every now and then, but that's common with reds, I think. And that's all there's to it. So I hope this was useful, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.